Oh, thanks so much. I'm glad to fit this in. Sorry I can't be over there as we are still, of course, on a planet wrapped in a pandemic. And I'm going to try to convey a fresh argument for how to think about communication impact. And in a world with too much information, way too much disinformation, and media ways of communicating that are so new that we don't understand them yet, including this phenomenon, being able to connect globally if you have access to the internet and through conversations. That's become an important part of what I do, very different from what I used to do. My opening slide, if you can see it, there's a hashtag that I started using several years ago, Make Reality Cool, kind of building on Donald Trump's, make America great again. We need to make reality cool. And I'm not sure if it ever has been cool, because we have some tendencies as human beings to focus more on attractive narratives, to focus more on our own cultural our connections to the people we're already comfortable with. So reality, we've seen this with the pandemic. If you end up in a situation where the information is not what really drives change, which is very different than being a journalist. And it's a very weird and distracting environment now too.
It is.
I included a little clip.
I don't know how to remove it. I've got my assistant here. She's trying to, but
I don't know if that thing made it to Germany, but it was this lawyer who got caught
I'm not a cat.
on Zoom. He's not a cat, which is very encouraging.
I can.
So my answer to this question is yes. I do think we can pursue impact on this planet and have reality have an allure. It has to have pull, or it won't matter. But it's going to be hard. There's a very big asterisk, and that's the work that we all have to do, whether we're journalists or scientists, or just members of the public who are concerned about building resilient communities and rapid change. My journey has been journalistic, almost all of it. I started out with a degree in biology way back in 1978, but I stumbled into journalism and never really left. That's me at the North Pole, down in the corner there at the Vatican, as you heard, along the Amazon River, writing about the revival of a great fish, the Atlantic sturgeon, that had been almost destroyed in the Hudson River and now is coming back. And it was all starting in 1988 is when I first began to write about global warming. That's the cover of the Discover magazine, which is a popular science magazine still. So 1988, that was the year the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was formed. That was the year that Jim Hansen, the American climate scientist, testified that he saw evidence this was already underway. It was the year that started the path toward the treaty, 1992, that the Paris Agreement is built on. And there was a very significant flaw, though, in that presentation. Back then, journalism, and here's the physical copy, was all unidirectional. It was me going out into the world, interrogating a question and telling you, an audience, what to think about it. And it was already complicated. Here's one illustration of how complicated it is. So the back of this science magazine in 1988, where we were conveying climate concern on the front, had cigarette ads on the back. This is a science magazine, not just a general interest magazine. And that says a lot about, I think, some of the complexities still in the news media themselves. As long as we're beholden on advertising money, things are complicated. But it was the same back 33 years ago. I came to the New York Times in 1995, when, again, it was still a unidirectional process. I was reporting on the climate talks in Den Haag and The Hague. And at the same time, the Supreme Court was trying to decide who was going to be president, Al Gore or George Bush. And you could see, the treaty talks made the front page, which was rare. And the stories that made the front page, the climate stories that were the most popular, were about the politics of climate, not about the science of climate. That says a lot. And I learned about the limitations of the news process, whether it's in Germany or here or anywhere. News is what happened today. Climate change is a very hard fit for these, what I used to call the tyrannies of the newsroom. The front page thought is, well, why do we need to have this featured today? The need for the new. Greenland, you know, if you're the science editor at a newspaper and there's a new study on Greenland losing more ice, the editor would say, well, didn't we already write about Greenland? The ice, and that's a challenge. Shock to trance was a phrase that Obama used talking about our energy policy in the United States back in, that was around 2008. We can't have a shock to trance approach to energy, meaning, you know, concern and then prices go down and we relax. But that goes for all of the stories we think about in the context of sustainability. Hurricanes come and go. The floods in Germany came and went. How do you sustain a focus on boosting resilience to flood risk when things come and go? For every PhD, there's an equal and opposite PhD. It's almost like a Newtonian law. And any one of you in the sciences knows this within your field. And the public doesn't understand that. And so the public sees argument, whether it's about vaccination or climate, and can be distracted and disengaged. And then space and time, you know, there's just no adequate space. Even online, you think, okay, well, I can now write 10,000 words. Doesn't have to fit on a printed page, but that actually, who reads the words? No one has the time to do the digging, to do the deeper reading. When I went to the North Pole, I shot this video. We're on the sea ice at the North Pole, a very remarkable place to be. And I was a print reporter at a print newspaper, but I shot video. And it became an important part of the package I was reporting. And something else happened while I was at the North Pole.
You can feel the chunk that we're on actually starting to fail a bit more.
There was an editor on the web desk. This is 2003. An editor in the newsroom said, hey, let's do a reader Q&A, like a question and answer session, like a Reddit Ask Me Anything session. In 2003, from the North Pole, you know, no social media. I had a satellite telephone, and that was the first time I actually actively engaged with readers, you know, other than through like a letter to the editor. And it was very exciting. I was writing my articles. I was thinking, though, about things that I wouldn't normally have thought about. I was talking to readers about the journalism process from being in a strange place. And that engaged me on the idea of a different model of journalism. 2007 is when I created the .earth blog at the New York Times. Also the same year that Twitter became a reality, and I got onto Twitter very quickly. You know, all of these arenas have problems, but they have incredible possibilities still. Twitter is where I go every few hours, and if I need to think about some new aspect of a problem, like what happened in Madagascar with the flooding and the storm just now, I can find experts almost instantly on Twitter who are engaged with those questions. In fact, I'm writing something about that later this week. So .earth, my blog, became more of a really a bi-directional, multidimensional conversation with readers, some of whom are experts, some of whom are just simple citizens, you know, basic citizens. And it changed my thinking. It broadened my view of the issues around climate change very much to do that. And, you know, I started to also focus more and more on visualization, digital communication of ideas using graphics. This was one on water stress in the Middle East. And it became exciting. But as you all know, the online environment also became very exasperating over these last 10 years. So I had the excitement factor of connectivity and audience engagement through my blog at the New York Times and through social media, came with the realization that online, we no longer had a sort of the front page view of the world. We go online and we all see the things we're already thinking about. And in the way we're already thinking about them. It's kind of like a big buffet, one of those restaurants where you can find whatever food you prefer. And that's true in the online media environment. You essentially selecting information, not really having a general conversation with common frame. And that became very discouraging. I took this picture at the climate talks in Copenhagen, 2009, the end of the talks when things kind of broke down. There's a TV journalist in the newsroom, and I often think about it when I think of these frustrating moments. And I'm sure if you're concerned about climate and any of the other issues that relate to sustainability, you've had some moment when you feel like this cameraman. And so group hug is a good thing once in a while. Understanding these are tough, challenging, but still very promising times when it comes to communication. There's a longish journey between the New York Times and Columbia, but it all involved a bigger transition with more of a focus on academia, not just teaching, but inquiry. You know, where I spent 30 years in journalism presuming I knew that a better story will create a better world. And the more I listened to scientists, especially in the social sciences, I began to understand that information doesn't change the world necessarily. Often it's really not the thing that changes people's behavior. And that felt like a frontier. So at least at Columbia now, where the Earth Institute is becoming what's now called a climate school, it's still broader than climate. I propose the idea of an initiative on communication and sustainability. It's really a lab. I'm not an academic. My only PhD is an honorary one. And it's just a place to inquire, to test drive these tools, to build conversations that can take us in new directions or connect experts who might not have talked to each other, or communities that might not have access to experts. And it was all going really well. And then this happened very shortly after I started, just a few months after, the lockdown and hit New York terribly. New York was one of the worst initial impacts of the pandemic. And that also felt like a group hug moment. And it was discouraging, as you all know. The flame up of the internet around the pandemic has been terrible. It's really hard to figure out what works and doesn't work. We seem incapable at some scale of being rational sometimes. But I started to see some really promising emergent innovations, and they were beautiful. In the earliest stages of the pandemic, in January of 2020, some scientists, engineers and scientists at the Johns Hopkins University Applied Engineering Lab saw all these flows of data around the spread of the virus and levels of mortality. It was very confusing. There was very inconsistent, and they launched a website, a COVID-19 tracker, that became one of the most viewed websites ever, I think, within a matter of a couple of months. And it really was just a couple of scholars there who did this. And that made me feel hope that there's a way to, really cut through. It's not the solution to the pandemic, but at least they were trying to create a consistent flow of data with some curation. And it was wonderful to see that. And others began to innovate. I'm sure this happened in Europe as well. There's a young marine biologist who created, she had already several years earlier created Skype a Scientist. It started as a hashtag on Twitter. It was basically scientists, most of them young, who were offering their services to visit students in classrooms via Skype anywhere. And that it grew in popularity, obviously, with the lockdown. And I think I had her on my webcast a couple of times to talk about that. I think it's thinking of that. What happened there is a scientist anywhere with internet connectivity can be in any classroom anywhere with internet connectivity. And there was a scholar at Columbia, a sociologist, he dove in right away. And this is already a dormant website. It's done because the job is done. But they were building a syllabus that that experts in fields could start to teach online who hadn't done that for high school students or middle school students. There was a course he did in how to be an ethnographer. How do you, here we are in this historic pandemic. And what can you as a middle school student do to chronicle the world around you in a way that historians someday will be able to analyze critically and usefully? And I just love that too. That was within a matter of weeks. My part in this was March 15th, literally as New York City was locking down. I got on StreamYard, which is this platform I use. It's one of several ways to broadcast to Twitter, YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, all at the same time, build a conversation. And I just started. I just was desperate to rebuild that community I had with .earth, but to do it in a way like we're doing right now, so we could create a global conversation around COVID-19 solutions and climate and sustainability questions. And it quickly developed a rhythm. I did a series of sessions, there are dozens of them, that I called Thriving Online. You know, how do we tip the balance in this ecosystem we're working in right now toward rational, productive, not just storytelling, but community building and problem solving. And that's been a very, it's built a real curriculum almost just by pursuing that question. I did sessions on policy and practice. I was really excited that, you know, early in the pandemic when India was going into lockdown, Modi ordered a total shutdown, and it was actually very problematic. It spread the virus probably more than it limited it because people rushed to their hometowns. And I had a live session with a food network in Bhopal, India. 3 or 4 people who were in there volunteering to distribute food to the poor people, the poor communities in the informal settlements in that city. And you know, one of them was in his car delivering food. And again, I just thought this is a great thing to do because there are other communities facing similar risks. Having they're able to share their lessons online felt really exciting. I had journalists on and experts in communication who were advising people on how to deal with information overload. How do you cut through this? What are the behavioral, how do you not become addicted to noise and addicted to conflict and debate? And that was very valuable as well. And on Sundays, it became more about sanity. I did sessions. I'm a musician. You see my banjo back there. And so on Sundays, I would invite musicians and poets and people from the humanities to just hang out. And we need to do more of that if we want a sustainable society as well. Some of those sessions were fantastic. There was a young musician from Zambia, people from Scotland, all over the place came together. And those they're kind of dormant right now, but I'll kick them back into gear soon. So, I learned a lot just from doing that practice, from engaging in questions through this whole period. And one of the key things that I've become passionate about is defining terms. We're surrounded by words now. I'm sure this is the same in German as it is in English. Words that have different meanings for different audiences, different meanings for different geographies. And the word denier, I don't use around climate because everyone is in some state of denial. And it's a word that immediately puts people into camps, divides them. And words like climate breakdown, energy transition, as you likely know if you work in energy, so far in the world, there's only been energy addition. Solar and wind and renewables are on top of a big heap of fossil use and have not actually supplanted it yet at the global scale. So, when we use the term energy transition, it'd be very good to be very specific. Well, I mean in Germany, or I mean in my community, or I mean in this sector of the economy, but not to think we're on some grand, we're already decarbonizing. That can give people the wrong idea. Climate emergency, fortunately, I think probably most everyone on this call, including me, is not really facing an emergency right now. There's a long scale question about CO2 reduction, but the world is very uneven. In 2016, I was in Nairobi for a UN meeting, and I escaped as much as I could to see the rest of Nairobi. And I was in a slum Matari with 500,000 people from 13 different tribes, stuck with very little opportunity, and they're 80 miles from the equator. Another point, that same year, in one of my frequent flyer years, I was in Singapore, and I was 80 miles from the equator, and I went to visit Gardens by the Bay, which is this, someone here may have been there. It's the world's biggest glass enclosed botanical garden. And there were people there. We were basically 80 miles from the equator, but in a Mediterranean environment. They had their olive trees, and the temperature was about 70 degrees Fahrenheit. And that says so much about the differential experience on this planet right now. So we're not in a planetary emergency in that sense. And so thinking about that really carefully is a way to get past their paralytic aspects to terms like that climate crisis. What do you do about the climate crisis if it's just the climate crisis? What do you do about the vulnerability crisis, meaning for people in Matari or Madagascar or vulnerable parts of Germany, or that then gets to actions you can do on different timescales to make a better world. This is like a 1-minute video clip. I'm going to show it because Diana Liverman, who's an IPCC author, she's a geographer at University of Arizona, said something really fantastic that's worth thinking about. When we think about risk, climate risk, it's the same thing. So let me see if this works.
When we talk about climate risk, some people still just think, oh, it's the probability of a heat wave, but we need to think about risk not as the probability of the heat wave, but as the probability of harm.
That
in
right
addition
there,
to sort of population.
she goes on to talk about poverty and the factors in societies that create vulnerability. But that whole idea of making sure we're thinking about the probability of harm, who has the highest probability of harm, as was the case near Blessem, Germany. It was people I think 10 or 12 people who died in that flood were in a group home. I think it was disabled. I can't remember the specifics, but they were particularly vulnerable to what happened. And thinking about that on the global scale, who dies in a hurricane in the United States? Tornado, it's usually people who live in tornadoes, particularly, it's people in mobile homes, which are these flimsy homes that are not built to survive a tornado. And if you live in a home with a shelter, tornado shelter, you don't die. I wrote a piece about the Amazon warehouse. We had the terrible deaths in one of the Amazon structures. And those deaths were totally avoidable. They had scrimped, they built these new giant facilities in a known tornado area and didn't put in storm shelters. Others have the storm shelters. People don't die. So that tells you so much. And one watchword I'm going to dig in on here, and I'm going to be writing a series of pieces on this, is the word collapse. In the context of Antarctic ice, it's one that's been overused and misused terribly recently, actually for a number of years. You've seen the headlines, I'm sure, there as well. The recent findings about the Thwaites Glacier and the ice shelf on the edge of the glacier, particularly, is eroding quickly. And the doomsday headlines talk about collapse, and the scientific papers use the word collapse. But when you talk to the scientists who are studying these ice sheets, they have a very different definition of collapse than the average person does. And that gets missed, unfortunately. Here was the British Antarctic Survey news release, December. The glacier currently contributes 4% of annual global sea level rise. If it does collapse, global sea levels would rise by several feet, which is absolutely true. The glaciers in that region are already on this slow journey to the sea, and we're facing several feet, meter or more of sea level rise, putting millions of people living in coastal locations in danger. What they miss there is the time element, and much of the coverage in the news, sadly, didn't ask the question, several feet by when? And this gets to this importance of just being careful when we use a word like collapse, because that is likely almost assuredly a journey of several centuries to get to that level of sea rise. There's a little bit of science pointing to the possibility of much more rapid rise, but it's highly tentative at this point. And to sort of see the headlines about doom, the doomist headlines, it makes it hard for people to retain confidence we could do anything about global warming. So I did a recent discussion of this on my webcast, and I'm going to do a piece on my blog about it. Just listen here very briefly and you'll get the idea.
I mean, we talk about people collapsing, we talk about bridges collapsing, and we talk about something being very instantaneous. We talk about something that's happening very quickly. When we talk about collapse with respect to a glacier.
Oops, sorry. Do that one more time.
I mean, we talk about people collapsing, we talk about bridges collapsing, and we talk about something being very instantaneous. We talk about something that's happening very quickly. When we talk about collapse with respect to a glacier, we really mean something that's accelerating or having like a step phase change. We're talking about something that's an increasing magnitude in calving or grounding like recession. But it could, even though it's in geological time very, very quick, and in geological time it would seem almost instant, it could actually take centuries. So it's still happening much quicker, but it could still take centuries. And the confusion over this term collapse, I think it's really important for the reasons that you were just illustrating, for people to be on the same page about communicating risk and not taking this out of context. Because people might start to think, oh, we're going to have 65 centimeters of sea level rise, by 2100 or something like that. And that figure then becomes very easy for people to attack. And that then seeds doubt in people's minds, and they end up getting very confused. That then means you end up distrusting the scientists ultimately.
It kicks back, and that I've seen this pattern, unfortunately, too many times. And here's another aspect of this. 6 months earlier, that was December when that news release came out, and there was that burst of coverage recently of the Thwaites ice shelf collapse. 6 months earlier, a major paper in Science, the journal Science, with no headlines, wasn't covered. Well, it wasn't covered because it said Doomsday Glacier may be more stable than initially feared. And here's the part of they had a press release that showed the physics of it, and it's very logical. Now, whether this one or the new work is correct or not is almost irrelevant. As a journalist watching these issues play out over time, it becomes clear to me that when you see papers diverging in conclusions over a very complex question, it means it's early science. We're at the early stages of understanding something. And so I started to think about this in the context of warning signs. It would be great for the media in the rush of online coverage to say, beware, this could cause whiplash. I wrote about reader whiplash in 2008 in the New York Times article when this was happening already over other issues related to climate change. There was a famed case in Costa Rica of a toad species that had gone extinct. And there was a big paper that said it was because of global warming. And then there were many papers that came out afterwards said, no, it's because it's this fungus that's running around the world, has nothing to do with climate. And what happens is readers get whiplash and they lose trust in the whole process, as opposed to understanding that early science, preliminary science, especially on complex consequential questions, is always tentative. There is divergence. And then the process of peer review and the other processes play forward. Unfortunately, during an instance like the pandemic, there's no time for all of that to play out, right? So we're immersed in conflicting findings. Everyone comes to that menu of news and papers and comes away with different messages. And you end up with these circumstances we've been in with anti-masking, anti-vaxxing, people who are too concerned about masks, people who are too focused on vaccination, let alone the climate problem. So it's a bit of a mess still. And I don't know if there's an easy answer. I do think that just being clearer when we don't know something about science at a certain time to convey that. These are little labels I put on my social media feed sometimes. Caution, publicity before peer review. How many pre-review papers on the pandemic have you seen? Dozens, hundreds. Caution, single study syndrome. This is where we have a tendency to focus on science that matches our predispositions. You know, confirmation bias, for those of you in the social sciences, is a real thing. And if you're in the news business, of course, you're biased toward, as I said earlier about the doomsday glacier, you're biased toward the bad news one, and you tend to kind of, the papers that come out that don't suit that news frame get lost. And there's one about narrative capture. We get captured by a narrative, and it's very hard to then be diverted by new data. So these are all tendencies that are just normal human tendencies. And I think to communicate effectively, it's important to try to sort of signal a little bit what's real, what's not real, where the uncertainty is real. Writing about uncertainty is important, not ignoring it. Way back in 2010, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change paid some professional consultants to advise them on how to communicate the report that was going to come out at that time. We're at number 6. I think that was number 3. And one of the scientists who was involved sent me a copy of the advice they were given. And I think it's the worst possible advice. Again, I'm a journalist. I'm not a professional communication consultant, but they were told here, below is a list of words that mean one thing to scientists and something else entirely to the public and to reporters. To lower the risk of being misunderstood, avoid these terms. Ask a media expert for alternatives. And the terms included uncertainty, risk. You know, to me, the whole idea, I think it would be better, my hypothesis, I'm not sure if it's testable, is that it's better for scientists to engage on those terms, to say, when I say collapse, this is what I mean, not to just throw it out there, knowing that your paper will get a lot of attention, and then to walk away and wait for whiplash to happen. A key thing I've learned through all of this is that my old mode of thinking, my old mode of being a journalist was very unidirectional, as I said earlier. And I think now much more about engagement and working across disciplines, across specialties, learning each other's languages, whether, I don't mean specifically foreign languages, but languages, norms of different cultures, norms of different disciplines. The word community is really about sharing and exchanging information. The exchange part we miss. We're all there. We're all in a conversation usually to just tell you things, like I've been doing for the last 20 minutes. And I'm looking forward to having the Q&A, because it's the exchange that's really the important part. Listen, engage, respect, which is there's not a lot of that these days on the internet. Collaborate, review, recharge, refine, and repeat. You know, test, iterate, evaluate, and try again. And again, across, it's not just disciplines and professions, it's also communities at risk. There was a really fantastic project at Columbia recently, the last several years, working with a Inupiat indigenous community in an Arctic village in Kotzebue, facing dangers as the sea ice off their village in Alaska was behaving in ways that were really unusual and linked almost assuredly to climate change. And this project had a funding model that allowed them to spend a lot of time essentially co-designing the research project. The indigenous elders and the community experts and the scientists from Columbia worked together to look at what was going on using their different skill sets. At Columbia several years ago, the artist Maya Lin, famous in the United States because she designed the Vietnam Memorial when she was like 21. She came to campus and I had her meeting with scientists to see if we could help her with an online project, whatismissing.net. And you can see it playing out there. It's data art. and it's going through new iterations now. And finding ways to cross collaborate between scientists and the arts is another part of what can happen. There are organizations like the American Geophysical Union that are experimenting with some really cool platforms and protocols for being useful, to communities at risk. There's this Thriving Earth Exchange. It's thrivingearthexchange.org, which is basically a way for a community facing flooding or erosion or landslide risk or soil depletion to find scientists who can help them build better policies. And it's a cross fertilizing. It's like Match.com or whatever the equivalent is. Getting people at risk together with people who might be able to help them resolve some of their problems. They find that this has only been going for 7 or 8 years. It takes time. These are not, you don't just come to as an engineer to a town or a village and say, aha, that's the solution. These are systemic problems and they require time and repeated, iterated conversations to build fluency and trust. And it's working, but it's tiny. The scale problem is enormous. So I don't know if they've ever talked to the European Geophysical Union, or this doesn't have to be the geophysical sciences either. It can be social sciences can do the same thing. Listening is a key, as you likely already understand. But active listening is really hard. Even as a journalist, you think, I'm going around with my pad. I got one here. Historically, I would go around and take a lot of notes and listen to people. But quite often, frankly, when a journalist is listening, he or she is just waiting for the nugget, the quotable phrase. And usually it's one that's sort of a hotter idea. It's something that might divide the community when they read the story, whether it's about abortion or vaccination or climate policy. So finding ways to listen more deeply and really understand what's going on is important. And there are these, this is just a really fun clip. Maybe it was 8 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, I was interviewing Jeremy Shakin, he was one of the authors of a really important paper on ocean heat and how it related to global warming. And it was a Skype interview. And at the very end, he said something that was really cool.
Before we hang up, can I ask you a question or two?
Yeah, of course.
If you got a minute.
Yeah.
So you've been doing this for a long time. You're probably doing this longer than me. So what's your view? How do you see all of this stuff? And yeah.
He treated our interview as a conversation. He asked me a question. And I think for scientists, a piece of advice I've long given is if you're being interviewed by a journalist, don't just sit there answering questions. You can also say, well, let's review. What are you taking away from this interview? What are the key points? What's confusing? And the more that simple exercise is treated as a conversation, the better. There are other ways scientists, as I'm sure many of you, if you are scientists, know, to engage meaningfully. About 6 years ago on Twitter, a young physicist at Caltech was the first person to post the hashtag, I am a scientist because, and the key word there is because. She found a way, she cited a fairly viral response from many other scientists. It's the because part is the motivation. Many of my scientist friends and people I've interviewed before tended to go directly into the methodology of their science or the technical details. I use this spectrometer to do this. And that doesn't engage people. But when you say, I study diatoms, or I study plankton ingesting plastic because I'm fascinated by this big question of how the ubiquitous nature of plastic is changing ecosystems from the most microscopic things all the way up to albatrosses. And then that's something that's engaging. It's about curiosity and motivation. And so I often ask scientists to do this simple exercise, just fill in the end of that sentence. I'm a scientist because ... Just finish that sentence, and that's the way to think going forward and how to engage with the community beyond your expertise. And scientists, though, also, and journalists too, have to understand that we're only part of the story. That there are many scientists who, there are some social scientists who talk about something called scientism, where there's a belief that science and data should rule, and that that's what drives decisions in society. Unfortunately, it's not the way things work in the real world. And finding a way to be a scientist and be a human being at the same time can get people into a sense of stress. And I did find, through talking to Ken Caldera and others, he's a climate scientist at Stanford, now working for Bill Gates. He taught me about the philosopher David Hume several centuries ago, who clarified that, as he put it, you can't get an ought from an is. An ought is, we ought to do X, we ought to solve global warming, is not automatically generated by the is of science. Science is the data that show us the risk landscape around us, but our choices as society are based on values, culture, even behavioral norms, like, as I said earlier, confirmation bias. It's not some automatic process. And so having a two-sentence rule is something that I found. There was a cartoonist who once illustrated this when I was giving a talk. Just splitting your ideas into two. I am a physicist. I study sea ice through models. I'm also a parent and a voter. I think we need to have a carbon tax, or I think we need more nuclear power, because an individual might think that, or another one might think we need all renewables. And then you can get into engagement about the difference between renewables and nuclear. But you're not saying, because I'm a scientist, I have some special magical expertise on what we should do as a society or what a policy should look like. Play is a word that we don't think about enough, even in these contexts. Just play with data. You've likely seen some very clever animations and the like this one, which I particularly appreciate. It's shows you the same people in different contexts related to urban transportation. You can turn climate data into music. I've written about this in the past. There was a young cellist at a university in University of Minnesota who worked with a scientist there a number of years ago, 10 years ago, and created a cello composition around with climate temperature data. And Julio Friedman, Carbon Wrangler on Twitter, is also a composer and a pianist, and he came up with another version of this. This is from 1400 onward. One set of temperature data. So something's definitely happening, right? And the question is, does that change people? And I think for some people it probably will. But this gets me into a whole arena. The more you dig into behavioral science related to behavior change around energy, climate, sustainability, resilience, there's actually only a tiny bit of research on this. We still largely don't know which kinds of visualizations work or don't work. There's perceptions, things become really cool. You know, we like to see them. The warming stripes, which I'm sure many of you know about, were an innovation of Ed Hawkins, a climate scientist in England. And they're all over the place. They're on the cover of The Economist. There are knitters now. Look, search for something called the Tempestry Project, TEMPESTRY project. And they're a community of people knitting climate stripes. So they're creating a physical object showing the warming trend in the climate system at different scales. And I love all of this. I did a recent webcast with Ed Hawkins and others, and with some researchers. And, you know, again, it's just the early stages of understanding which things like this will work, or are they just sort of attractive to those of us who are already concerned about climate, or they, and you hear anecdotes, but let's find out. So getting the social sciences really dug in here, including with more funding, is really important. This shows just another iteration. Alex Radke, who's in Germany, he took the warming stripes into the future. Because one thing you see here, the warming stripes initially just are paleo climate data right to the present, and they don't really project forward. And Alex took model results and started to show us the color, more than one color path going forward. And again, what's so cool about that is it only happened because of Twitter. Alex Radke and Ed Hawkins saw each other on Twitter, and the collaborative potential grew out of that connectivity. So thinking about Twitter or other platforms like this as a learning collaboratorium, essentially, is really, there's a lot of potential there. Play with others is just getting outside your disciplinary niche. It's hard, it takes time. This was before pandemic on campus, I was doing this, getting people together. This was journalists and climate scientists. It's harder to do on the internet, but it's doable. And you can help, there are artists now. This is an artist, Staci Levy, on the right, who there's a famous piece of art in the Great Salt Lake, Utah, by Smithson. It's a big jetty made out of rock, goes out into the lake, spiral, high concept art. And Staci Levy does art that remediates the environment. She's doing these floating wetlands that she made it in the shape of Smithson's spiral, but it's actually living plants that suck extra nutrients out of these bodies of water. So that requires scientific engagement to get them right. And that's just one example of what can happen. There are some seismologists I've written about. Roger Billum is one of the leading earthquake experts, warning of these great earthquakes that are going to happen in the Himalayas. And he and Rebecca Bendick, a number of years ago, created posters in Pashtun and other languages throughout the Himalayas, showing you that if you mix cement one way, sort of in a parsimonious, economical way, your building could fall down. If you do it another way, it could be sturdier. So they're going beyond their science and using storytelling as a way to see if they can create some better outcomes in the things that they're focused on. Someday we'll be back to a world that's more in person, and there's lots of ways to engage. In classrooms, there's a bio bus, which is getting kids excited about electron microscopy. They put an electron microscope on a bus and take it to school systems that can't afford any of that. And that, the more of that, the better. It's kind of like a physical version of Skype a Scientist. There's lots to be done there. And this is what I explore both on my webcasts and my blog. I call it a blog. I'll just call it a newsletter. Sustain What? And you can sign on. It's free always. It's supported by Facebook. It's a new thing, a new platform, and I feel very, I have mixed emotions about that. But I also had mixed emotions about this. Remember back in 1988, cigarettes were supporting my magazine. Everything seems to be a trade-off, and there's no ideal path forward. I do think Facebook is trying at least to make up for some of its sins. They're supporting regional journalists. So far, it's not really international yet, but you can certainly subscribe, and the issues that I focus on are all global. Finally,
all around us there's hatred.
You have to sustain yourself. This was one of the sessions of my Sunday show.
Touches our lives, and the message is clear. We mourn our martyrs. In our hearts they'll stay. Then we'll sing, we shall overcome, and go on our way. We will not rest till the storm is over. Yeah, we will not lay this burden down. Yeah, we will keep each other strong. We'll love and carry on till we stand all together on solid ground. Till we stand all together on solid ground.
Yay.
The best.
Oh my gosh.
the best part of that was the ending when Genevieve Gunther there, she's writing a book on climate language. She's a scholar, you know, and just to see, you can actually have emotional impact. You can really create a community even through a screen sometimes. It's not ideal, but it's something that's possible. And that excites me every time that happens. So, you know, we are here. This is a technology-enabled photograph from the Cassini device way beyond Saturn, and I'm here. So I'm happy for questions and more. Thank you.